Hmm. is live.
Sure.
It's good to know.
Thanks for the heads up, yeah. Yeah, we got timers and whatnot.
Let's see, did I get an email? Yeah.
You all good?
You got a chair? I'm gonna move it. I move with it? Yeah, it's a little light on batteries. We can plug it. Wow, we're still
Alright, so you two ready?
Yeah.
Alright, you good? Sweet. The resolutional question of indefinite detention cannot be delinked from Islamophobia. Ongoing discrimination and violence against Muslim people and those constructed to look like them has been maintained through a culture of collective suspicion, prejudice, and hatred. Koenigsegg 12. The events of 9/11, the United States response to them, and public misunderstanding of Islam have created a culture of suspicion and prejudice towards Muslims or those perceived to be Muslim. Those fear and hostility towards Islam is Islamophobia. Their mindset has resulted in stereotypes, hate crimes, discrimination, and the violation of rights of Muslim Americans. Muslims are subjected to hate crimes, workplace discrimination, unreasonable arrest and detention, verbal and physical harassment and abuse, ethnic profiling against Muslim Americans is encouraged and accepted by government authorities. Anyone can take steps to defeat Islamophobia by encouraging empathy for others and participating in activities that promote discussion between people of different faiths and ethnicities. Muslims constitute almost all of those detained since 9/11. Islamophobia plays a large part of Guantanamo's detainees. Too many Americans. The prevalent misconception that Islam is equivalent with terrorism justifies the violation of human rights at Guantanamo. Now, Islamophobia makes executive war powers a permanent feature of society, separate from the battlefield. The war on Islamophobic bodies and those who look like them is ongoing and enables racist institutions like indefinite detention. Butler 6. The license to detain on the basis of suspicion alone is enormous. We have seen it and work in racial profiling, the detention of thousands of Arab citizens, sometimes on the basis of last names alone, harassment at immigration borders, and the attacks on individuals of Middle Eastern descent on U.S. streets. The objectless panic translates into suspicion of all dark-skinned peoples, especially those who are Arab or appear to look so, to a population not well versed in making distinctions between Sikhs and Muslims or Arab Jews and Pakistani Americans. Deeming someone dangerous is license for racialized ways of looking and judging in the name of national security. Islamic peoples or those taken to be Islamic has been targeted by the government mandate. The state constitutes the detained population unilaterally taken out of the jurisdiction of law, depriving them of legal protection. They are populations not regarded as subjects. There is something more in this degradation. There's a reduction of these human beings to animal status. The bestialization of the human in this way has little to do with actual animals, since it's a figure of the animal against which the human is defined. The language with which they are described by the U.S. suggests these individuals are exceptional, that they may not be individuals at all, and that regular criminal and international codes cannot apply to beings such as these. The treatment of prisoners is an extension of war itself. Their detention stops killing. If they were not detained, they would apparently start killing on the spot. They are beings in a perpetual and permanent war. In a sense, the war is not and cannot be over, because the post-war prison becomes the continuing site of war. The rules that govern combat are in place, but not the rules that govern proper treatment of prisoners separated from the war itself. How can the war end when indefinite detention is a continuing act of war? War seems to have established a permanent condition of national emergency, and this system of thinking also shapes U.S. foreign policy. The notions of Western superiority over the Muslim East are a critical tool to drum up support for militaristic violent interventions committed in our name as Americans. Kumar 13. Larger numbers of conservative voters are racist. Islamophobia is far more systemic than that. The idea of a Muslim enemy is built into the system of U.S. foreign policy. To ignore that fact has larger implications in terms of justifying U.S. foreign policy would be an incomplete picture of what is really at work in this form of racism. 9/11 enabled the U.S. to draw on stereotypes that these are crazy, irrational people. They are all apparently driven by Islam to violence, so we should lock them up, detain them, and so forth. It's about justifying the building of a national security state and justifying practices like torture. You see the Bush administration projecting the idea of clash of civilization as basically the idea that we in the West are democratic, civil, and rationalized. We are all things wonderful, and they in the East are barbaric, misogynistic, and we have an obligation, what used to be called the white man's burden, to go off and rescue them. It's a combination of the victim narrative and combined with the language of clash of civilization. The U.S. government and U.S. imperialism always needs an enemy, and an enemy is extremely useful to justify wars abroad, as well as the policing of dissent at home. It's truly horrific the extent to which Muslim Americans and people who look Muslim have been demonized since 9/11. The affirmative advocates for an anti-subordinationist practice centered on challenging Islamophobic indefinite detention policies. Racial subordination remains the remaining question in our status quo debates about this topic. Conventional debates around law versus security that center on legalistic technical solutions ignore the racialized nature of executive power, which means that we must foreground racial considerations as a prerequisite to expose the failures of the resolution. Got 5. The subordination question will consider how scholarship constructs national security law in ways that afford primacy to racialized harms that surround national security powers. The anti-subordinationist methodology foregrounds such problems and allows us to assess the real cost of states of emergency by moving beyond standard law versus security framings. We are better able to grasp the identity-inflicted basis of the constructed security rights, and the anti-subordinationist perspective allows resist unrestrained political decision-making. These national security rationales are socially constituent, reflecting societal pathologies such as racial and ethnic animus. The legal literature typically orients itself around the narrow problem of how to balance the conflicting demands of law and security. Legal liberalism has not confronted the subordination of racialized enemy groups, Arabs, Muslims, or South Asians. Formalistic civil liberties-based critiques of law accommodate law to national security-related necessity and animated by valorization with state security needs. So the business-as-usual approach may occlude key subordinationist dimensions of the war on terrorism. Anti-subordinationist principle require taking a more complete account of how enemy groups are racialized and how they come to be constructed as outsiders and the kinds of harms that befall them as such. Familiarity with racialization is a necessary precondition for appreciating and remedying these injuries. Applying anti-subordinationist thinking to national security law does not require arguing that only race-based effects matter, but it does require affording significant normative weight to such harms. Racial injuries require racial remedies. Anti-subordinationist principles in national security law depart significantly from traditional approaches. Interests of demonized enemy groups are ineffectively engaged through accommodationist framework. The impulse to acquiesce in the political process results from an incomplete grasp of the racialization process. More race consciousness is needed in national security law and policy to cement substantive commitments of procedural safeguards against historical and ongoing race-based subordination through the racialization of security threats. It is important to advocate for our practice in this space. Interrogating Islamophobia in educational settings like the university is critical to establish a consciousness that enables students for larger political projects. House 12. Having reflected on Islamophobia, the work of anti-racism in university classrooms is fundamentally important. Our work in university classrooms is the beginning of the challenge against racism and other oppressions. Classroom discussions form a very important contribution to the work of anti-racism in education. The work of anti-racism is difficult. Classroom exchanges could be the key to promoting anti-racism. The student voice that critiques mainstream thinking is a starting point for political work. Our classroom should encourage critical consciousness necessary for social justice. While I acknowledge the limits of university spaces, I argue this is a good starting point. Educational exchanges may become the awakening for bigger political projects against injustices in society. If we are not working for equity in our learning environments, then educators are inadvertently maintaining the status quo. Students and teachers can be transformed. In the current times of Islamophobic racism, when racist attacks are a daily occurrence, a place to start this campaign is higher education. Education can enlighten students, and educational settings should be the first arena in which battles against Islamophobia can be fought. It's the education that our attention should be directed. Finally, the deconstruction and interrogation of flawed assumptions behind Islamophobia in our 1AC is critical to establish a transformative liberatory pedagogy that enables us as educational agents to challenge racist dynamics. Zine 4. As an anti-racism scholar and educator, there was an urgency to frame a critical pedagogical response to rampant Islamophobia affecting the realities of Muslims from all social conditions, the most vulnerable of children and youth. There was a clear resistance to addressing or even naming issues of racism and Islamophobia. The nation of Islamophobia did not have any currency at all. It was not part of the language used by educators, even those committed to anti-racist pedagogy. I realized the urgency to map a new pedagogical terrain by creating an educational framework for addressing Islamophobia. The existing equity-based frameworks could address issues of racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, and anti-Semitism. However, the discursive foundations for dealing with Islamophobia and accompanying educational resources simply did not exist. Before a methodology for anti-Islamophobia education, it was necessary to develop some discursive foundations to create an understanding. Islamophobic attitudes are a system of power and domination that manifests itself as discrimination and oppression. Exclusionary practices are shored up by ideological underpinnings designed to pathologize Muslims as terrorists and threats. Understanding how these systems of oppression, such as Islamophobia, operate socially, ideologically, and systemically has become a key component of developing the educational tools that build critical skills needed to analyze and challenge these dynamics. Reclaiming the stage requires a pedagogical approach that shifts the discourse away from the tropes of otherness ascribed to Muslims. This move involves presenting a critical counter-narrative to reframe the clash of civilization narrative. Another foundational aspect of anti-Islamophobia education involves interrogating systemic mechanisms through which Islamophobia is reinforced by analytically unraveling dynamics of power in society that sustain inequality. Negative attitudes are relayed to students through a hidden curriculum of schooling. Developing critical pedagogical tools to challenge these systems of domination is part of building a transformative and liberatory pedagogy towards achieving greater social justice in both schools and society. Deconstructing stereotypes is vital to helping students. The critical examination of the destructive impact of the ideological divide between to exposing how power operates. Good
really?
Cross-X, yes.
You open for cross-X?
Yeah, do you need a timer?
That's awesome, dude. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm interested in the term that you use, Islamophobia. Why shouldn't we think of the current treatment of Muslims as discrimination or racism what distinguishes it such that we should call it Islamophobia and use that term?
Sure. We believe that the racism that exists against Muslims and those racialized to be like them has some unique features, including a fear of difference, right? So phobia, fear, and that the West has constructed the Muslim East as being an entirely different civilization, so that it's not so much that they are inferior per se, but that they are so radically different that we fear the very alternate way of like social existence that the Muslim represents to the West.
Gotcha. Given that that fear and that conception is so ingrained as you established in the 1AC, why should we believe your advocacy statement, which says we should have an anti-subordinationist approach to stop that, would be able to overcome the entrenched Islamophobia you talk about?
Sure. We think that the best way to go about that is our method that deconstructs stereotypes and forces students to engage in a critical examination of the narrative of Muslim terrorists.
Can we look at that part by part? How do you deconstruct stereotypes?
We sort of take this notion of first the conflation of Arab and Muslim, and then the conflation of the Arab-Muslim terrorist who's pathologized and made threatening, and show that it is a historical falsehood and built into the system of Western foreign policy to justify things like the Crusades.
Gotcha. So your argument is that if you're able to tell folks that Arab and Muslim are different, and that Muslim are terrorists and different, that people will stop being Islamophobic.
Our argument isn't that we will like end the racism against Muslims and those racialized to look like them, but that this pedagogy provides the starting point for political projects and an open dialogue that is explicitly against racial subordination in national security
In those
law.
political projects against subordination, is violence ever justified?
Needy?
No.
Gotcha. What criteria should Julian use in determining who wins the debate?
What criteria?
Yeah.
I mean, I just think the team that does the best debating. Do we have a roll of the ballot in the 1AC?
What determines what the best debating is?
We think we've made arguments as to why our advocacy is good, so if you prove it's bad, then you better debate it out.
Gotcha. Your GOT evidence says that anti-subordinationist principles would prioritize remediation of harms imposed on Muslims, Arabs, South Asians, and other demonized minorities.
Sure.
Why do you think you came up with that list, Muslims, Arabs, South Asians, and other demonized minorities?
I think that Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians are those that have borne the largest brunt, so to speak, of Islamophobia, while the other groups experience unique forms of racism like anti-blackness that is sort of maybe helpful to heuristically separate those two in an academic paper, but I have no idea why.
Okay, last question about the GOT evidence. In the unhighlighted portion, it says, pragmatically, it makes no sense to fight terrorism by alienating Muslims through abusive treatment and double standards operative in identity-based repression, preemptive abroad. Such double standards undermine democratic legitimacy of the U.S. and assertions of global leadership. We'll take prep time, I guess, for that question.
It proves the internal inconsistencies with the U.S. strategy. So it proclaims
proves why it's why what you're doing would be able to restore democratic legitimacy.
No, it proves why the narrative that's constructed has internal inconsistencies. We claim to espouse leadership, but don't meet up to that. Not that we should be leaders, but...
Rashad, do you want to speak off this chair?
No, I think I want to maybe set up this thing.
Okay, sure.
Do you want me you want to switch off?
Plan is
What do we have? Have 2 off and then the case, which will be comprehensively covered.
Sweet.
Is everyone ready?
Yep, we're good to go.
First off cases is domination critique. A subpoint, anti-subordination is fundamentally an approach about codifying classification, naturalizing difference. This ensures continuation of dominant power relations. The debate should be about which method better combats dominance. This is Brittingham in 2004. The most important question of anti-subordination perspective is the classification of the issue. Classification itself is the beginning of the analysis. The long-term implication of being classification is based on the different treatment is allowing them to be misused. Invoking classifications may be inherently dangerous because it obscures the way in which the powerful dominant the powerless society views the world. According to classification, society legitimates the treating members of those classifications differently. Those classifications thus are trends to become normal function and excuse to treat members of the different classifications disparately. Thus, the debate becomes which method better advances the interests of the members of the disadvantaged classifications. And B subpoint is the alternative breaks out from the equality difference standoff to offer a better focus on domination and relations of power. This is McKinnon again in 2006. Genders, inequality of power, social status, been permitted on who to do what to whom. Only derivatively can is a difference between the sexes that descriptively exist between a doormat and it's definitely different from other beings of man. This is where woman's realistic options as they are. So then it calls the question explanatory value, the political gender implicit and determined gender difference and differences we attribute to sex or lines and inequality draws not kind of basis for differences or inequality. Both hot exclusive and conclusory artifact has become represented in origin and damage. It is pointed to the justification of those damage has been done. The distinction between perception and socially organized notice between the inequality gives them consequences for social power. Inequality becomes first, difference comes after. Discourse on gender differences serves the ideology to neutralize, rationalize the cover the disparities of power. The glove of the iron of the fist of domination. This is true when differences are firm, when they are denied. To make the change requires a new way of thinking about just thinking about new things, the determination of structural force, the possibility of freedom. At the same time, people are more radical than anyone has ever been without the unknown, because what has ever asked the probability has never been asked is probably what most need to know. The unknowable is most serious than anyone has ever had, because the woman has died without a trace, but invent the capacity to act because otherwise women will continue to. Next off case, pessimism. A subpoint, make an impact. The affirmative policy proposal is nothing more than a contingent right of the plan seeks liberation from a failed status quo, but this liberatory project only reinforces the coherence of civil society and produces black suffering. The affirmative celebration of experiential change produces ontological violence on the black because it ignores the structural position of blacks as slaves within society. This is Wilderton, 2007. The circulation of blackness as metaphor, the image of most politically volatile and progressive moments in history, i.e. French and English and American Revolution, produces dreams of liberation which are more essential to and parasitic on the black and more emphatic in their guarantee of black suffering. Any dream of human liberation, any era heretofore, black suffering is foundation to modern humanism. Because freedom is the hub of humanism, infinite conceptual trajectories. Those trajectories that only appear to be infinite. They're finite in the sense they projected the idea of freedom in some contingent can be named or at least conceptualized. The contingent rider could be a freedom from patriarchy, freedom economic exploitation, freedom from political tyranny, taxation, representation, freedom from heteronormativity, and so on. Political discourse recognizes freedom as a structure and ontologic which works to disavow this recognition by imagining freedom not through political discourse recognizing freedom structure ontology now we were disavowed recognition imagining freedom not through political ontology but where it might rightfully begin but through political experience and practice whereupon we lose an ontological foundation and allowing the notion of freedom to attain the ethical purity of its ontological status. One would have to lose one's human coordinates and become black, which is to say that one would have to die, but for black freedom it's ontological rather than experiential question. There is no philosophically credible way to experiential a contingent rider onto the notion of freedom which one considers the black, such as freedom from general economic expression or the kind of contingent riders that rightfully placed in the non-black. When thinking of freedom, the writers can only place black freedom on the hyperbolic no less true, the ultimately untenable freedom from the world, freedom from humanity, freedom from everything, everyone's, including black self, every reigning episteme that chances of elaborative, comprehensive, much less transferable, communicable political project out of the necessity of the freedom of the absolute gratuitous freedom has never been a trajectory of humanist thought, which is why the infinite trajectories of freedom that emanate from humans are anything but finite, and they have no line of flight leading to the slave. B subpoint, the alternative is to refuse to affirm each and every affirmation only gives civil society more coherence. Reject this shallow reformism in favor of an endless antagonism that reflects the positionality of the black. Wilderson in 2007, the American subject does not generate categories, entitlement, sovereignty, immigration. For the record, we are off the map. This places us in a structurally impossible position, one that is outside the articulations of our presence works on a grammar of hegemony and threatens it with its incoherence. Decolonization, which stacks out the change of the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. So completely a repository, complete disorder is the black body. The Negro is gratuitous violence, the southern program of complete disorder for the revolutionary movement. Black liberation makes radicalism more dangerous to the United States because the condition of possibility function is a complete disorder must embrace incoherence. The gestures, the positionality of the black subject gesture source of the disconfiguration of society is a black specter waiting in the wings and is an endless antagonism that cannot be satisfied via reform or reparation, or that must be nonetheless pursued to the death. And there islamophobia is important, but it is not essential to our understanding of state violence and war powers. The black suffering is a precondition to all of their harms. This is Sexton in 2007. The multiracial approach fails to appreciate, aside from the inherent injury is sold and sold to usual suspects, becoming concerned about the problem only when it becomes immediately to you and yours, and the highly contingent nature of the injustice in question, whether one is talking about the attack on immigrants or the special registration of Homeland Security, or even when talking about the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, it is not unreasonable to conclude that the undeniably reprehensible or tragic events were nonetheless inessential through clearly unimportant to the operation of the U.S. state and civil society. That is, it could have otherwise have happened without fear of crisis, catastrophe, or collapse. The mass imprisonment of citizens and non-citizens of Japanese descent, for instance, was dependent on the hysteria of World War II and foreign policy objectives of the Roosevelt administration as sufficient condition of possibility. A necessary condition was, to put it crudely, the history of anti-Asian racism in the United States, harassing, deportation, demonizing effective Homeland Security has entangled the geopolitics of the United States and post-Cold War grand strategy of the unabated warfare required for capturing outlandish oil reserves, illicit drug markets, and natural resources, and becoming absolutely spare. Racial profiling is operates for blacks anywhere and any time, whereas for Latinos or certain Asian Americans, it is more or less confined to the poor or working class neighborhoods. Residential segregation, as well as class-bound issue, is a class-bound issue for Latinos and Asian Americans. For blacks, it is a cross-class phenomenon, so much so that even the most segregated Asian Americans, including the most Southeast Asian refugees, are more integrated and more integrated than middle-class blacks. Poverty is principally transitional for immigrants, but transgenerational and deeply entrenched for blacks. Undersigned signifying a segment of the black population permanently expelled from the political economy. Nationally, Latinos are incarcerated at a more than twice the rate of whites, but blacks are at nearly 3 times the rate of Latinos. The suffering of non-black people of color seems conditional to the historic instance, even if long-standing and even empirically function as a different scope and scale. The oppression of blacks seems to be invariant and does not mean that it's simply unchanging. It mutates constantly. This sort of comparative analysis will be unquestioned and reflect in the formulation of political strategy and the demeanor of our market there. How about that? Our refusal includes the refusal of the affirmative multiculturalism. Their demand results in the reconfiguration of civil society, which is bad. Wilderson in 2007. No. Already read that. Case. First argument is racism didn't start with 9/11. Their anti-blackness precedes it and exceeds their militarism argument. This is Sexton in 2007. Empire thus exceeds its political, economic, and military rationalities whenever blacks are concerned. The multitude could stand to learn the lesson, the sooner the better. We must learn that the attention and pleasures of militarism itself, the pure enjoyment of the collective destruction and social fantasies of death and dismemberment and delights in martial law. Prior to the events of 9/11, the rebuttal economy of anti-blackness was brought into sharp relief by international reform and the question of racial profiling in the United States, but the most critical analysis they have consistently retreated from its discussion on the favor that we are now a hackneyed explanation or merely moral denunciation. Needless to say, the issue never fails to resurface productions each time the most acute interference in the discourse and organization of radical politics, and we must center blackness around in order to be able to solve racialization. This is Wilderson in 2007. The value of reintroducing the unthought category of state by the way of noting the absence of the black subject lies in the black subject potential for extending the demand placed on state capital formations, because its reintroduction to discourse expands the intensity of the antagonism. In other words, the positionality of the slave makes a demand that is in excess of the demand made by the positionality of the worker. The worker demands the productivity to be fair and democratic. In contrast, the slave demands that production stop without recourse in its ultimate democratization. The absence of black subjectivity from the crux of radical discourse is symptomatic of the text's inability to cope with the possibility of that degenerative subject of capitalism, the black body of the 15th and 16th century of the of the 15th and 16th century. The black incarcerated body in the 20th century and the 21st century does not reify the basic categories that structure conflict within civil society, the categories of which is work and exploitation, and the nonviolence can only achieve meaningless reformist goals. There's no historical examples of successful nonviolent resistance to structural oppression. This is Ganderloos in 2007. Unless we change the power relationship and destroy the infrastructure and the culture, centralized power can make the same possible subjugation of the many of the few with those who currently benefit from the ubiquitous structural violence. This will continue to call the shots. The elite cannot be persuaded by appeals to coincidence of individuals who do not change their minds and find a better morality when they are fired, impeached, replaced, recalled, assassinated. Time and again, people struggling not for the same total reform, but for complete liberation, the reclamation of control over our own lives, the power to negotiate our relationship with the people of the world around us. Nonviolent does not work. We face a self-perpetuating power that is immune and appeals to consciousness strong enough to plow the disobedient, uncooperative. Nonviolence has never actually produced historical victories towards revolutionary goals. And the next argument is that their sidelining of black suffering prevents any kind of solvency. This is Sexton in 2010. Obscuring and structural position of the category of blackness will inevitably undermine multiracial coalition building as a politics of radical opposition. Every analysis that attempts to understand the complexities. We'll stop there.
Okay. The first K? It seems like the link argument that this card is making is that our acknowledgement of classification calcifies these, categories and structures that maintain dominance. And I don't understand how our, speaking of those classifications makes them more real, right? It's not like Islamophobia only existed because we said that it exists.
It's not that you invented Islamophobia by naming it. Our argument is that in focusing in the difference, the way in which Islamophobia, for instance, is different from other forms of discrimination, like as you described, anti-blackness, prevents us from talking about the source of that, which is the domination part, which is how does this come into existence? Who created this difference?
All right.
Anti-blackness creates the difference between black and white, between black and Asian, between Asian and South Asian.
How does that interact with this Sexton card, which seems to sort of say that there is a valuable benefit from separating forms of domination, and says that the multiracial approach fails? Because it seems like the alt to the first K is like recognize this unitary sense of domination, and then the alt to the second K is like, you can't do that. You can only focus on anti-blackness.
No, the argument is that we need to focus on structures of domination. That's exactly what both critiques do. The first argument says that your starting point of difference is the problem, and that we need to focus on relations and structures of domination, of which we articulate a system of anti-blackness as being the most important and essential explanation to both your 1AC and to civil society.
Okay, sure. So, can I assume, based on the card that you read on the case, that the alternative to the second critique does and can include violent resistance?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Can, not necessarily does.
Sure, that's fair. How does pessimism interact with the alt to the first K? I know this is sort of a question that we've already discussed, but it seems like the alt to the first K has a lot of language of like hope of getting out of structures of domination.
No, in each instance, it's a refusal to affirm.
It's just as simple as that, just a refusal to affirm.
Yes.
All right, fair. Can you explain to me I guess under the lens of pessimism, how we talk about racial issues that are separate from anti-blackness?
There are no racial issues that are separate from anti-blackness. Anti-blackness and blackness is the truth rather than the totality of the situation, which means that we can understand what's happening to Asian Americans and South Asians by understanding what has happened to black people. Racial profiling preceded 9/11, right? So
right.
That's how we understand difference and why people need to be targeted. It's because they're brown, their proximity to blackness, their inability to assimilate, their markers of difference, which always makes them a target for death.
Okay.
Can I take some prep to look at the two cards you read on the first K?
Oh, yeah. Did I not jump them to you?
No.
Sorry.
No, that's
It's a tough piece here.
We got a ton of pens if you want one. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. The back of that is mine.
I'm done.
okay, good. That mine can start.
You need shit from me.
No, I don't think so. Alright, I'm good.
I got 850 for us left.
I'm done with your laptop, so you can take it back whenever you...
Can you speak for 1 second so I can get this part back?
Can I take the table thing?
Yeah, please.
Sweet.
Oh.
How many args were in that case?
4 args.
What was the second arg?
The second argument was we must center our discussion on anti-blackness.
Got it. Yes. Can you get your speech?
Yeah, I'll just give it to you.
that he said he was getting close, but he's lost.
He's still lost?
Yeah.
Ron wants to know if you can give him his contact information.
Yeah.
He's going to give you the phone number.
You good for an order? It's case, the domination difference K, and then the anti-blackness K.
Did you jump yourself?
Yeah, it's on, I think right there.
Sorry, did one more time about it?
Case, then the subordinationist principle bad K, and then anti-blackness K. Okay. This debate will largely become a method question, but even if it is, you should not forget that there is a tangible impact to the 1EC. They have conceded the Butler evidence as well as the Kumar evidence indicates that Islamophobic and definite attention policies have maintained a state of constant warfare. The idea of war powers itself has an internal contradiction because war is always ongoing. The Kumar evidence indicates that the justification of saving Islamic women as well as liberating them from the uncivilized Islamic cultures is necessary to justify foreign interventions as well as domestic profiling through the first two arguments as well as the fourth argument. Anti-blackness, even if they win that it is historically accurate, they have no defense of why this is a productive method, a productive description of reality. We are not a sole focus on 9/11. Our piece of evidence precedes the founding of America and says that Islamophobia can be traced back to things like the Crusades, which is a more historical understanding of structures of domination. Additionally, we do not make a chain of equivalency or a prioritization argument. We say that they are all distinct and have value in study as a useful heuristic to separate them, which is why we have a unique focus on Islamophobia. We don't say one before the other. Additionally, the 1 and C in Block's argument will almost entirely rely on historical narrative of slavery. The founding of America is tied to anti-blackness. Even if it's factually accurate, it's not a defense of their politics. Their historic analysis doesn't respond to the complexities of modern American racism. Some terminate the binary justified because the historical precedent the African American experience, the black white binary, the complexity of historians, which the conflations of the black white binary and valid realization social justice because it seriously undermines the possibility of achieving coalition public relations, anti-political basis historical claim. Mission when Native Americans claim to Native American possess their own history. The claims of the black white binary social representation that would raise the importance of this history by assimilating Native Americans. The black white binary violence to the distinction by raising Native Americans claims precedence and anti-blackness is not the master key. The focus on it as such skews discussions of racial justice. It ain't the future of race will not be determined through black white politics. The racial problems that we have were determined by history between whites and blacks and solving black white confidence and master key all racial problems. Black white binary has called the U.S. reaction toward Native Americans, Asian Latinos, and colonial subjects. The binary does not engender accurate descriptions of the racial past and keeps discussions of the future toward the perspective interests of blacks and whites. So black white binary is rooted in black white American nationalism, xenophobia, and the people of the United States should not capitulate to desire that the false image of America as black and white not be upset. Additionally, the non-violence argument, violent resistance is intrinsically connected to violent masculinity and patriarchy. The move toward violence ensures resistance failures and subjugation of those seen as weak. Bartowski 13. Armed resistance is rooted in warrior psychology that's shaped by violent masculinity, patriarchy, juggles that congratulate violent bravery and patriotism, which leaves little room for recognizing the importance of non-violent natural strength of the contribution of women or for not fighting young women men to the struggle. The discourse of hegemonic victory tend to conform to a masculine construct from the antiquity to the present of society, suggests warriors no fight for protection, beautiful social female victims are combated as inhibited people from remembering, acknowledging, understanding, repentance, and effects of resistance, including the essential place of women armed struggle with violent masculinity symbolically joined in belief in the necessity of violent struggle to overcome oppression is not a neutral conception grounded in fact. It's the result of intentionally distorted history that privileges armed combat. The negative offer case studies disrupt the dominant narrative. Additionally, if we win that non-violence is better, then this is also an impact turn to the alternative on the anti-blackness case. Bartowski 13. Historical accounts support the common belief that violence needs a weapon to win freedom from subjugation. They ignore the power of historical role that non-violent civil existence of plating course of liberations existence, the impact non-violent organizations defines that commonly been noted in a number of historical structures besides the ways to diverse methods of non-violent resistance by ordinary people, relation-driven bottom of non-violent mobilization, barbs are critical more so than structural changes of violent revolution that dominate the history of revolutionary struggles. These histories have often been misinterpreted and raised, although collective memory buried beneath and eulogize violence, commemorative rituals, glorify death, murdered heroes, and women sides villain insurrection, carving historic tradition shows how the action of ordinary people overrun by the authority to keep control. Offensive cultures occupied by extreme repression. The approach not about action often upside spread knowledge of historical events and process generate distorted and even idealized fear of violence, alive with extreme structure based on interpretation tension, centered on source of violence, all dim blood, the quiet non-violent resistance of militarily and militarily powerful empires have been defeated by completely unarmed opponents, not because they met irresistibly bound force, because of mobilization of population. Mark the card at mobilization of the population. Additionally, their gender lose evidence is attacking a strong person. Martin 2008 critique suffer through inadequate understanding of a nonviolent gender attack principle nonviolent perspective, in which the end justified the means he dismissed nonviolent action campaigns using a set of arguments display systemic double underlying gender lose argument. The assumption that violence is more effective than nonviolence critique and nonviolence have any real teeth. The assumption needs to be justified. Counterexamples of just gender lose shows almost no awareness of pragmatic tradition and nonviolent action. Even represents nonviolent action as consistently solely approaches persuasion, missing the more coercive methods of non-cooperation and intervention. The first critique. This piece of evidence is uniqueness, or their critique argument is uniqueness for the affirmative. There are classifications that have been established in the status quo, not by us, but by the state in determining difference, i.e. saying that certain people are Islamic or from a different culture. Is a fear of that difference in the status quo. Only the affirmative challenges the idea that that difference is something that is constructed and helps break that down, which means that the permutation to do the affirmative and the alternative is the best option. Now, there's also no link to their critiques of equality, which is what their second piece of evidence is established. We do not try to normalize all times of a difference, but instead recognize that each instance should be recognized as a useful heuristic. It's also a contradiction with the piece of Sexton evidence they read, because it says that unitary understandings of all racial groups is problematic, which is what the critique proposes. Additionally, their critique is problematic or got evidence in the case that attempts to paper over difference. When understanding the legal system fails, we control uniqueness because in the status quo there's an oversaturation of neutral colorblind approaches to the law, i.e. we say that there is a domination of certain groups, but that is not racially marked by any particular difference. Our evidence indicates that this is problematic because it gets reinforced into law, security versus liberty debates, and does not understand the way in which racial subordination is a crucial subtext. This also promotes an understanding of the law as something that is neutral, but instead something that is racialized. It's impossible to understand inequality without understanding difference, because every single law is marked by difference in some sense. Additionally, only understanding difference isn't a strategy that can promote change. Our Halcyon Zine evidence is specific to the role of the law in the context of pedagogy in the university space, and says that we need to understand difference as the basis for interrogating assumptions of Islamophobia. For alternative to this critique is a dressed up form of colorblindness. Additionally, all of our non-violent good stuff arguments is offense against this critique alternative, because if violence is something that's consistent with both of them, then it proves that all of our offense applies here. Additionally, if we win any of our arguments about what anti-blackness is a poor understanding of racism, and it also answers this, because in cross they explicitly tied to this by explaining that the structure that plays everything is anti-blackness. Additionally, we are not an approach that ignores structure. The first piece of evidence, as well as the Kumar evidence, indicates that war power is something that exists structurally through things like indefinite detention and legal things that legal strategies that need to be interrogated by the 1AC. The other critique. Permutation do the affirmative as an act of renegation against civil society. The affirmative's challenge to Islamophobic indefinite detention policies creates an ideal intersectional space to build coalitions against racial violence, but they must coalesce around particular projects. Swing and 3, despite the racial coalition can be a useful tool. Blacks will have to learn to work closely to ensure the black conservative laws and to use position favor minority. Latinos need to learn for African Americans to achieve various goals. Coalition good for Asians. History will show that they remain professional borders. Native Americans can benefit from blinking Arabs and Muslims need to join a coalition because they are too small. They need to draw upon the breaches of other group coalition building. Must coalesce on particular project where there is commonality of interest. Racial profiling is a potential issue. The war against terrorism, racial profiling particularly affecting Black, Latino, South Asian, Black, Arab, United intersectional issue of coalitional building with the establishment system, Americanism, and the war on terrorism. They demand the minority temperature low team Trump is about concession will choose one minority group for favor treatment. Bush administration could reconfigure form of action to ensure Black more, but God who wants some people will be able to work together toward mutual goals to rule the current factionalism and districts continue with the various minority groups competing for crumbs. And Islamophobia presents a challenge to our status quo understandings of race. The U.S. has launched a civilizational and cultural war on Islam. Racism has moved beyond exclusions based on biological difference to a new differentialist racism based on culture, samadhi, and 10. Within the post-9/11 moment of crisis, the racialization have been constituted by cultural racism, national origin, cultural racism, both on conceptualization of race and culture. The shift in dominant theoretical form of racism, the race theory based on biology is placed by one based on culture. Individual behavior cannot be attributed to biological origin. They are the product of different cultures. Balber argues that new racism without racism, new racism takes account the failure of the classical racism, which is viewed the others in sphere, the other self-dichotomies no longer explaining inferior severe affirmative this the racism. The era of decolonization, cultural functions like nature and it can function as a way of blocking individuals. Genealogy, the dominant theme is the insurmountability of cultural difference to racism, which jumps postulate the superiority to recruit the only the harmfulness of abolishing frontiers. Balber characterizing your racism as different racism. Individuals have characterized the current geopolitical conflict of religion, cultural civilization. They full diatribe against the more respectful version of their different level culture is used as a substitute. Its function is to preserve racial difference and to strengthen the extent racial hegemonies. Islamophobia should be understood in these terms. And we must question traditional anti-racism strategies when faced with this new form of exclusion grounded in xenophobia and citizenship. Balabar, in 5 goods, bring out the political consensus, the consequences that change the perception of the traditional anti-racism argumentation, finds self-attacks of the rear, not trying to get to self-racism, to constitute isolable biological units. There are no human race. The difference racism takes an argument at its word. Biological naturalism is the only means of naturalizing human behavior. Culture can function like in nature as a way of looking at individuals and allocating individuals and groups in a prior to genealogy. If insurmountable cultural differences are true natural milieu, the abolition of that difference will necessarily give rise to defensive reaction, and confident that generalized aggression, such reaction we are told are natural. We now move to the theory of racism, or the struggle between the races of theory of racism within society, which naturalized not racist belong, but racist context and versus racism is a second position racism, which presents itself as having drawn from the lessons of the confident racism and anti-racism politically operational theory of the cause of social aggression. It is not by chance that the theories of differential racism connect easily with toxicology, which enjoy provide a general explanation for irrational moves, aggression, collective violence, and xenophobia. Now, there's no link to their arguments about how our attempt at freedom. We say that inclusion is something that's problematized in Central because we attempt to include the Muslim body into the United States through intervention.
First question for you. How does the act lead to black liberation?
The piece of wing evidence is a defense of why the permutation would do that.
So the affirmative by itself offers no hope of black liberation.
Well, we don't think that's not true. We think that we can recognize that some of these structures are intertwined, so that the affirmative may not be the end-all, be-all solution, but it is in the direction of resolving the structures.
How does the act result in black liberation?
The piece of Samadhi evidence and the Balabar evidence says that racism has moved beyond racism as a hierarchy to racism based on the fear of difference. And so racists now, in response to the movements of anti-racism, now position racism not as something in which someone is better than someone else, i.e. one race exists in a hierarchy, but instead that all races are equal, but we should just fear the integration of them, that we should fear difference and the meaning of those races. And so our argument is that solely focusing on anti-blackness is an inaccurate understanding of that, and our challenge to Islamophobia is a way to challenge the way that racism now operates.
How exactly does challenging Islamophobia challenge all other forms of difference?
Well, it doesn't. Our argument was that they're intertwined at a level, so it's a move in the direction, but the permutation.
Do you have any explanation for why blackness does not account for all other forms of...
Yeah, we do. The piece of Sundstrom evidence says that there's two arguments. First is that the 1EC does a little bit of a historical analysis, and it says that things like Islamophobia predate the foundation of America and go back to things like the core states.
My question was,
I think
you made a claim in the 1NC that focusing on blackness can resolve all these other forms of difference. Do you have any answer to that claim?
I think some of the implicit assumptions behind that claim is that the reason blackness structures racism in America is because the foundation of how America came into being. And so if we win that our historical analysis goes previous to the foundation of America, then I think it implicitly answers some of those arguments.
How is Islamophobia essential to the foundation of America?
It's not, but our argument is that it predates America. And so anti-blackness cannot explain it.
Understanding of America.
I mean, it is in the sense that...
Is your app not in America?
It is, but it's also talking about how racism is...
the importance of your app in America. If Islamophobia is not foundational to this country, slavery is...
Well, argument was not that it's not foundational, but it's not the only...
You just said that.
Well, I meant that it's not the only foundational explanation, i.e. that there's no foundational explanation for all racism.
You say, how do we focus on a black-white binary?
So the Sundstrom evidence talks about the positioning of whiteness versus blackness.
What do we say about whiteness? Do we ever say anything about white people or whiteness?
Either way, this piece of evidence talks about
either way?
Well, because I think
where's the white in the black-white binary?
Because I think the Sundstrom evidence makes links arguments about the hierarchy that's established when we say that blackness is the explanatory factor of all racism.
Do you ever talk about Native Americans? Because your evidence talks about the disavowal of Indian suffering and Indian positionality. Do you have anything about that in the app?
Yeah, and that piece of evidence as well as the wing card we read in the 2AC. But that card's that challenges the history of...
over, thank you.
Prep time? Mr. Feldman?
See? I got it going.
Okay.
I'm not going to use much, though. Actually, yeah. I'm good. Oh shit, I just need to figure out how to get you cards.
You don't have to take prep for that.
Okay.
How much do you have left?
932.
If you have to take prep, I might take some then.
Here, I can take some more. I could highlight some of these cards. I'm obviously not gonna. I'll take a little bit more.
Bro, do your laptop.
What did the cards say? I didn't get to see them.
The first one was like classifications reinscript different, but both numbers like classifications maintain that difference exists. Which is very much seemed like a race to a card. That was just like you remind us that races exist, so then it reinscripts the fact that race exists.
Yeah.
But we're not believe that race exists. I was thinking about that.
Silence. So even if we didn't say it, it would always be there.
I was thinking about that, and I think we have some ability to say that for the audience, depending on how they explain it. So I'm 100% confident that they're already just colorblind.
But we should definitely characterize it that way.
Yeah.
For sure. And then
Put the show in here. I think we.
what's that first Sunstrom card say? It's like slavery.
It just says that.
Modern.
Or it just says that. So it makes the obvious claim that there's no linkage between. Because. So he just says that the authors don't make the linkage to show why, because slavery is the foundation, why that implicates all race relations now. So, like, he says they do in theoretical sense, but like, why does that actually implicate relations work? And also, if it's true, then it should be anti-blackness because anti-blackness gets into
Okay. Let's not gonna. 720.
Yeah, it's Stanford. I think it's Ella, because it doesn't sound like Suki.
Yeah, it's definitely.
Right, I actually have to put the jump drive. You kids with your newfangled technology. Your tweeter machines. Joe, can you write down 720?
I've got it on a piece of paper here.
Okay, 2
Is she speaking, or is this cross-X?
I think she's speaking.
You look at my cards before I speak.
Crow.
For me too.
Share instead. Is the chair
Can be lower, but can be less space.
I'm gonna go to the non-violence argument on case. This is insane. Yes. And then the domination critique, the critique that isn't the pessimism argument. This isn't great.
Just non-violence on case.
Yeah.
The paper.
That sucks.
Yeah.
Okay, that's him. Or the other. Okay. Whoa. What just happened? Sorry, my computer just kind of freaked out. Okay, I'm on LinkedIn. This is like total karmic revenge for all the debaters I've been
For all the debaters you bitched at for stealing credit.
Not enough. Okay. I think we're okay. Okay. Everybody.
Yep.
Extend our nonviolence fails argument. They say that violent resistance is bad. Group all their arguments. It assumes an explicitly violent struggle. Our argument is that violence must be sustained as an option, not that the resistance to oppression must forefront violence, but rather that we... Nonviolence is ineffective. There's a pattern of historical manipulation, whitewashing evident in every single victory claimed by nonviolent activists. India, the story goes, people in the leadership of Gandhi built up a massive nonviolent movement. The actual history is more complicated than many violent pressures also forced the British to withdraw. I'm like jumping around this card and like clipping or something. Pacifists claim that the independence of India is a victory for nonviolence that plays directly into the historical fabrication carried out in the interest of the white supremacist imperial states that colonized the global south. I'm going to skip to the bottom. The withdrawal of ground troops can be most clearly attributed to factors of success and sustained violent resistance of the Vietnamese, which caused U.S. policymakers to realize they could not win, and domestic anti-war movement had not become powerful enough that we can say force the government to do anything. In any case, its most forceful evidence use violent protest bombings and property destruction. Spreading nonviolence sustains patriarchy, embracing a productive role for violence is necessary for empowerment protection. Gelvaluso 7. Nonviolence is patriarchal. With gender nonviolence an inherently privileged position, nonviolence assumes that instead of defending ourselves against violence, we can suffer violence patiently until enough of society can be mobilized to impose it peacefully, that we can expect to transform the aggression that threatens us individually. But pacifists seem not to have given the violence of patriarchy its due consideration. After all, in wars and social evolution in daily life, women and transgender people, the primary recipients of violence of patriarchal society. Nonviolence implies this immoral for a woman to fight off an attacker or study self-defense. Mark the defense. They make a generic indict of Gelderloos. They say it doesn't understand violence, but our historical analysis, we've already proven why it matches theirs, and it explains it more than theirs does, which means that you should prefer the evidence by Gelderloos and also prefer the historical examples we've given. Domination critique, please. The affirmative offers a false choice that we either have to fight oppression by focusing on formal legal equality, or that we have to fight oppression through an anti-subordination perspective that focuses on categorizing difference. Neither of these approaches are satisfactory because the equality approach says that everyone has to act alike in order to receive protection. Women have to act like men, black folks have to act like white folks, then they get protection. However, the anti-subordination approach of the affirmative is equally flawed because it says that groups have to act different in order to receive protection, which locks in differences like gender difference as a result of domination domination, also the perpetuation of domination because they require fitting into preconceived stereotypical molds in order to receive protection. McKinnon explains further in 06, 2 alternate paths to equality emerge within this dominant approach. The leading one is be the same as men. This path is termed gender neutrality. To women who want equality and find that you are different, the doctrine provides an alternative route. Be different from men. The differences branch exist to value or compensate women for what we are and have become distinctively as women, by which is men unlike men. My concern is not which of these paths is preferable. My point is logically prior to treat issues of sex equality, issues of sameness and difference is to take a particular approach. I call this the difference approach because it is obsessed with the sex difference. The main theme in the fugue is we're the same, we're the same, we're the same. The counterpoint theme is but we're different, but we're different, but we're different. Its underlying story is on the first day difference was, on the second day division was created upon it, on the third day rational instance of dominance arose. There is a politics to this, concealed as the substantive way in which man has become the measure of all things. Under the difference theorems we are measured according to our lack of correspondence with him. The critique necessarily outweighs the affirmative because it both proves that it's a flawed method for resolving Islamophobia, but also that it's a method that is detrimental to the struggle against other forms of oppression, such as gender domination. Our McKinnon evidence indicates that the affirmative's conception of difference is the velvet glove that hides the iron fist of domination. The purpose of the debate should be to determine whose method is most effective in fighting dominant power relations. That's established by our 1C Brittingham evidence. The 2AC number 1 makes a uniqueness argument against a critique, which is patently absurd. First, they reify that difference that exists in the status quo by creating a resistance strategy that begins with the idea of difference instead of what the negative is saying, which is that we should begin with the idea of domination. Second, the alternative solves that. That'll be a little bit lower in the alternative debate, but yes, there are problems with the status quo approach as well. The status quo has a neutrality equality approach, but our argument is that the method that the affirmative uses to fight that is equally as flawed. 1C, 2AC number 2, they say that we don't try to normalize difference. The thing that's harmful for the affirmative in this instance is that there's only one piece of evidence in this debate that talks about anti-subordination struggle and the difference equality paradigm. That's our 1C Brittingham evidence, which means that the negative has more specific evidence on this question than the affirmative does. It indicates that the anti-subordination principle starts with and is obsessed with categorization, that the creation of difference, reification, and codification of difference is the anti-subordinist approach, which the affirmative hasn't read a plan, but they've read an advocacy statement which says what they're committed to is the anti-subordinist approach, which means that's what you should be using to evaluate the debate. 2AC number 3 says it's a contradiction between the two arguments. There is absolutely no contradiction. Both arguments, what I'm going to go for in the 2 and C and what Rashad is going to go for in the 1 and R, start with the presupposition that we should begin our analysis with power relations. The whole link to this critique is that they begin with difference, we begin with power relations. For instance, the black-white binary is not something that naturally exists. The black-white binary is something that was created by white people in order to lock down domination. That proves that we begin with that power relations analysis, which then creates difference, not starting with difference, which is what the affirmative does. Please group the number 4 for 5, which is the group neutrality argument, where they accuse the alternative of being neutrality and colorblindness, which is not what we are. Our alternative solves the case and solves the critique index as well. The best way to conceive of the alternative is as a third option for a methodological starting point. The status quo says we have to start with legalistic equality. The affirmative says we have to start with difference. The alternative says we have to start with domination and power relations. This is not colorblindness or treat everyone the same as the affirmative accuses of. It is not a unitary vision of power. It recognizes difference, but it recognizes that power relations are the things that created the difference, not that difference led to power relations and domination. It says domination came first to create the difference that oppression uses. The affirmative says difference came first, then led to domination. McKinnon explains further. 6. There was an alternative approach, a dissident answer. Here on the first day that matters, dominance was achieved probably by force. By the second day, division along the same lines had to be relatively firmly in place. On the third day, if not sooner, differences were demarcated together with social systems to exaggerate them in perception. In fact, because the systematically differential delivery of benefits and deprivation required making no mistake about who is who, man has been resisting ever since. Gender might not even code a difference, might not even mean distinction epistemologically were it not for its consequences for social power. I call this the dominance approach. The goal of this dissident approach is not to make legal categories trace and trap the way things are. It is not to make rules that fit reality. It is critical of reality. It proposes to expose that which women have had little choice but to be confined to in order to change it. The dominance approach centers on the most sex differential abuses of women as gender abuses that difference guard could not confront. These experiences have been silenced out of the different definition of sex equality, largely because they happen almost exclusively to women. To be on top of a hierarchy is certainly the sex equality questions are questions of systematic dominance, of male supremacy, which is not all abstract or anything but a mistake. Differentiating into classifications in itself is discrimination. From the point of view of the dominance approach, it becomes clear the difference approach adopts the point of view of male supremacy on the status of the sexes. So long as sex equality is limited by sex difference, whether you like it or don't like it, whether you value it or seek to negate it, whether you stake it out as grounds for feminism occupied the train of misogyny, women will be born, degraded, and die. And anti-subordination ensures segregation that turns the whole act by solidifying both external and internal oppression. Brittingham 4 said the segregation is inherently dangerous. Segregation segregation occurs in society, think in terms of classification. Segregation entrenches the classification that serves as the root of the problem. Although segregation processes today spring from an anti-subordination motive, segregation may function as an invitation to discrimination. Their last argument, they say that nonviolence applies. That's on the case. They say poor understanding of racism. Prior to Rashad will cover that. The legal strategy thing, I don't think that matters.
Okay. For the non-violent stuff, under what conditions can we determine that violence is relevant or justified?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different conditions. One is when it's necessary to match state violence. So, for example, in instances when the state is attempting to crack down on repression using violence, that there are times when, for self-defense purposes, violence is necessary, as well as, at some point, if we try a reformist strategy, and it doesn't work, and the state continues to ignore demands, then there has to be a statement that, hey, if you're not going to listen to our demands, then we're going to have to use violence in order to be able to overthrow the structures.
You refer to like a collective we, or I guess when referring to the people that make the determination of when to use violence, who determines when these conditions have been met for violence to be justified? Is there like a leader that says now violence, before not, or is anyone in any movement
I think
always able to use violence?
I think there's a couple instances where that pops up. So, for instance, in the self-defense determination, it's the people who are being attacked who are able to make the determination of violence. I also think, I cited the example of Malcolm X as an important leader who was able to identify violence as a strategy. So there are leaders
you just
said, as well.
You just said assuming all of these occur, then people can make the determination. My question is, who makes the determination that, for example, there's been enough state violence,
I answered that. It's a combination of the people who are actually being attacked make that determination because they're being attacked, and also I do think leaders are important. So Malcolm X was an example I gave of a leader who is able to say, if these demands are met, then there needs to be violence and there needs to be change conducted by any means necessary.
Okay, if there are certain group of people that are, for example, being detained in Guantanamo, can we identify that they are racially different from the people that are avoiding the burden of being detained in Guantanamo? Or
our argument is, so of course, differential treatment exists. Our argument is about where the starting point between the connection of difference and domination should begin. We say first there was domination. That domination led to difference, like the differential treatment of Islamic people in Guantanamo. Our evidence says the anti-subordination principle begins with difference.
Domination leads to difference in the context of the foundation of America and slavery. So explain that through that historical story.
Absolutely. It was necessary to create difference, to say that blackness is not human in order to allow slavery to occur. So the first move was the domination move to say we need to dominate those who are not human.
The thing you just said is that blackness was constructed as not human, difference was constructed in order for slavery to then occur, which seems to me like difference led to domination.
No, the domination came first, because fundamentally, there wasn't a human So if you believe that black people are not human, then the difference comes first. I don't believe that. I believe that creation, that black people are not human, was something that was created out of power relations. It's not a naturalized difference.
So then, my question is, what does the category of black people mean? Like, how do we determine who is black and then who is subject to anti-blackness?
So that's determined by the dominant power relations. It is the whiteness and the white gaze that determines who's black, and so treats those that they determine to be black as not human.
That was...
I'm gonna do a stand-up one more.
Hey!
You still got it.
Exactly.
I'll take a second of prep to ask one question. Can the alternative to the critique you extended include violence?
We've established the position that we think that violence should be an option.
Okay.
So we're not going to pick out.
I remember the last time I heard stand-up 1R.
Hey, I was all over the place in those cards. I'll mark them if we have a second.
Sure. We made an agreement before the round that there can be no clipping accusations, so you're safe.
I'm not worried about the clipping accusation. I would just like to accurately show you what parts of the evidence I read.
Okay, sure. There's a highlight function on Microsoft Word for that usually.
That's not how we do it in the old school. I tried to highlight on my computer. It's okay.
It'll be the case debate and then an overview on top of pessimism.
Okay. I'm assuming that you'll take the Sexton cards that are on the case.
Yeah, everything not non-violent.
All right, sweet.
And I'll start by answering his little overview.
For sure.
At the overview, he said that this debate is about competing methods. That their method is bad because it's anti-black. They say that they have tangible impacts, but anti-blackness is a tangible impact, and it outweighs anything that they say in the 1AC. They say that there's a constant state of warfare against Islamophobia, but that's ridiculous. There's a constant state of warfare against black people that exists in the foundation of this country. He conceded in cross-examination that Islamophobia is not foundational to this country. It was founded on slavery, the rape of the black continent, for the creation of human and creation of this entire country, extending our wilderness and sexing evidence from the 1AC. Now extending 1AC number 1, that racism has been started with 9/11. That explained above racial profiling is something that existed before 9/11, and anti-blackness as well as Islamophobia that existed within this country in relationship to slavery as the foundational act. That's our wilderness and evidence. Extending 1AC number 2 that they defended their position on the anti-blackness is the truth as well as is the truth of the situation rather than the totality. It explains the 1AC in the way in which Islamophobia works. Blackness is the thing that can never be incorporated, is the ultimate marker of difference as which everything else is situated. That's why Islamophobia is a problem. It can never be incorporated or never become same. Can't become same, but it's closer to that than blackness, which is why it's a form of suffering that is coherent, which is why the 1AC can present itself as a tangible impact. That black suffering is not tangible. They cannot understand it. That is the disavowal. That is the impact to the 1NC argument. You can understand exactly what happens to South Asians and other immigrants because they have some coherent claim to suffering and some coherent claim to sovereignty, which the slave cannot get, which is why you should vote negative for our alternative. Extended number 4 that they sideline the issue of blackness. They read a bunch of cards about the black-white binary. There's no link to any of these arguments because we do not make an argument about the black-white binary. We talk about anti-blackness and how that structures all other forms of difference and all other forms of relations, which means that it's the truth of the situation rather than the totality. That's our Sexton evidence, which accounts for their arguments. Their own analysis of focusing on Islamophobia doesn't solve for any of the issues that the evidence talks about. It doesn't raise issues of nativeness or Native American sovereignty or any of those, which means that this is a reason to vote against them as well. Our analysis is still better because blackness can account for what's happening to what happens to Muslims in this country. Okay. Our alternative alone is better than their affirmative. They've conceded that the refusal to affirm results in the destruction of civil society, which includes their affirmative. The negative is opposed to Islamophobia, and the affirmative, we refuse to affirm Islamophobia, we refuse to affirm difference, we refuse to affirm racialization, refuse to affirm biological determinism, refuse to affirm civil society, and refuse to affirm the category of human. By any affirmation in this debate is an affirmation of civil society. They have conceded that their demand is one that can be recognized and can result in the reformation of civil society. The fixing of the law and the making of human better and whole, and that entire redemption story is the problem in and of itself, and there are a few reasons why that's a reason to vote negative. First, civil society exists in the creation of black death. Every reformation of the law in civil society results in black death. That's a linear link argument. Second, is civil society itself is the cause of the 1AC harms, not Islamophobia. They misidentified the problem and the solution. You should vote negative on presumption, and it's try or die for the negative. Since the civil society will result in perpetual war, which is the internal link, or return to their overview argument, and their inevitable disadvantages to the affirmative that they can never solve. 2AC number 1, they say permutation, but first argument is that it's mutually exclusive. The affirmative is anti-black. You cannot affirm the affirmative in any way that's not anti-black, which means you cannot vote for this permutation at all. Secondly, all of our link arguments are disadvantaged to the permutation, and they have considered a few. First is that they obscure black suffering by assuming that there is a policy solution, which is our argument from the first Wilderson evidence about contingent versus gratuitous forms of suffering. There is no policy solution to black suffering. Only a complete end of civil society will do, which they do not offer us, which only the alternative does, which you should vote for. Secondly, is that they prevent any kind of type of coalition because they crowd out black suffering. That's our Sexton evidence from the 1NC. That their impact arguments below prove this argument because their argument is that blackness is always associated with a biological, but with being biological as well as which allows them to dismiss it in name of difference, which means that we can never articulate black suffering within their permutation or their 1AC. The third argument is that their understanding of his suffering as contingent is the fundamental problem, and the disavowal of black suffering that is at the heart of the 1AC. This is Sexton in 2007. The specter of complete disorder has always been essential to black liberation in the United States, where prevails instead of the current conjunction of concrete preference and national sacrifice of blacks and political entities not bearing rights, also articulating legible demands of public sphere to pursue undercover institutionalized disavowal would amount to intensified partisan battle within the framework of already anemic liberal democracy. In consideration of the structural position of blacks is absolutely vital to the range of progressive causes that have come in the wake of 9/11 and the legal defense of those targeted by anti-terror position, which means that their permutation can never solve, doesn't offer any kind of hope for black people, and the alternative alone solves for their 1AC harms. 2AC2, they say that that Islamophobia challenges the status quo. That's false. It's only the slave can do that. Only a complete destruction of civil society. Theirs is one that's coherent and can be incorporated into civil society. Is why their act fails. They say that xenophobia and citizenship, that's problematic because the slave slave can never call into those categories of sovereignty or of sovereignty and never make a claim to the land, never make a claim to the nation. We don't exist here. We exist off the map outside of this country in outer space, which means that there's xenophobia and citizenship is a complete collapse of the structural position of the slave, which explodes these categories of difference in and of itself, which is why the alternative in and of it alone is best. We refuse xenophobia and we refuse the category of citizenship, which is why our alternative solves the act. They say no link because they don't attempt to solve for freedom, but what are you talking about? Your entire act is to offer freedom from Islamophobia. Our entire point is that the specification of your freedom, that you can offer freedom from Islamophobia or any specific type of situation, is the problem. We need freedom from the entire fucking world, all of the civil society. I need freedom from my skin. You cannot offer that with your goddamn plan or your goddamn advocacy statement, which is even worse. The alternative alone is better. Here's more evidence on that. Sexton in 2007. Metaphor comes to being through violence that kills the thinking, not in conflict may live. Coalition policy comes to grips with American structural rationality when it calls into capitalism and political economy, and not in structural political rationality and the anti-production of late capital.
Okay, starting prep for us.
Maybe even put the case stuff first and just actually one or two of the tricks and starts to be like, I'm not about stuff out with some Sean's yards. Proof that we don't sell the other than
Rachel just watched. Rachel called.
So that's mainly what you want me to do.
that makes sense to you, right?
Yeah. It's kind of a cop-out, but it makes sense.
I mean, we have to win.
Can you explain that actual nuances or the anti-subordinationism is segregation?
Let me reread that card. You should say there's no link to this card. That's the stance card. You should say that we are not every one's interpretation of anti-subordination means that it's invaluable national security law. So this card says that gender classifications can be used to segregate. The permutation to resolve that because we can recognize how people are not accusing them as the basis for segregation.
Wacky.
That's useful. You see how he's prepping even though prep
I'm saving the cards for you to read.
You learned that after being on the block a few times?
I don't even want to read your bullshit cards.
The cards we're about to hand you are terrible. So bad. The person that cut them is totally
I understand what you're doing.
I'm actually not putting a little start with one easy. How about that?
Okay, I made one thing.
See how they take prep time
Yeah.
when it's not prep time? That's an old school tactic.
I'll just
Something they did back in the day before timers. Okay. I'm gonna go on to the Domination K first, then the Pessimism K, and then the case at the bottom.
Say one more time.
Domination, Pessimism, case. Categories of difference and forced assimilation is the status quo. Difference is a uniqueness question that decisively flows from it. If we do not create difference by speaking it into the debate round, the language of the 2NC, the reification of difference, assumes that it is not always already reified. We both unmake it through a critical interrogation and deconstruction of the categories and stereotypes that make difference, but our very speaking it into the round is completely impactless because it is something that always existed in the silence of spaces and the hidden curriculum of schooling that taught us the stereotypes about Muslim people. Now, old school debaters still have to answer permutations. There is no explanation of a forced choice between difference and domination. Even if the differential categories of West and East were created by dominant power relations, there is no reason why a focus on difference displaces a focus on domination, which he needs to win to prove any link arguments. Otherwise, it's just a starting point K, which doesn't have a reason why the starting points can't be combined. Now, the alternative could never solve the case because obviously the power relations created the difference, but that difference must be analyzed in its specificity. They've conceded Housey and Zine, which prove that they're solvency cards for our method. There's also no link to the final argument. We aren't everyone's interpretation of anti-subordination as pedagogy. The permutation would solve because it can be used for segregation, but the permutation would ensure that it wouldn't. Wilderson. First, extend the permutation. There's just the very act of affirmation is not inherently anti-black. If our affirmation is that against civil society, which is what the permutation would do, the war on terror is a coalitional space to include the issues of anti-blackness. Our wing evidence says that their focus would obstruct that. We also have an alternate explanation of racism that is more accurate to the current understanding of how it works. Our Samadhi and Balabar evidence indicates that the modern explanation of racism focuses on neo-cultural differences. Then our Sunstrom cards said that slavery is not an explanatory factor in the way that racism has manifested itself in the modern era. Anti-blackness is not a master key that can explain all of the situations of racism, and if we do this, it proves that their theory can't explain ours, but ours can explain theirs, because there is a fear of blackness in that it constitutes a difference from white civil society, which means that our theory is preferable. Now on the case, the obviously our argument is not that 9/11 is unique, but our historical accuracy is decisively better. The Crusades prove that the conflict between the West against the Muslim precedes the very existence of America as a nation and is more foundational to differentialist racism. Obviously, Islamophobia is not foundational to the U.S., but that is because it is foundational to the which is a prior question. Now, the non-violence debate, we will win here. It is a offense against all of their critiques and a decisive reason to vote affirmative because only we rule out non-violence. The term, the external impact is patriarchy. Our Bartowski evidence indicates that it is a masculinized form of violent resistance that valorizes the warrior who acts against oppression. Even holding this on the table would obviously be enough to trigger this impact because it allows for violent warriors to supersede women by allowing that option to exist. exist. Now, nonviolence is not passivity, which means his characterization of us as smiling in the face of oppression is attacking a straw person. Our argument is that you should go to government buildings and prevent them from functioning, that you should stage sit-ins and things that interrupt the normal functioning of civil society. Now, the foundational principle in nonviolence is key. Any allowing for a single violent tactic to come in means the entire movement just becomes violent. Domhoff 5. Complete adherence to it has been abandoned by some activists to move toward the inclusion of violent acts of the repertoire. Movement tactics began when Black Power advocates became increasingly impatient with lack of responsiveness to plans for increasing political economic integration. Out of the civil rights movement, several leaders gave up on nonviolence and working with whites to feeling black on all sides. Data that whites would become any less prejudice. Many African American communities exploded on their own, starting south to Los Angeles. The long-term effects of the violence were negative. Outbursts were an understandable reaction, but they were nonetheless a political mistake. The facts that they occurred showed the entity for any future movement to have its principles clear and in place before becoming involved. It is not possible to spread the word about why violence disorders are not a good idea while they were having a new egalitarian movement. I have to explain why they are protecting the goal between lights and wax. Explain as the disruptions hinted, suspicion and anger were increased on both sides. Cities like Newark and Detroit still has not recovered. Now, political organizing through nonviolence solves better. That's Bartowski 13. Political organizing, but the key ingredient of people's revolution that helped the military weaker successfully challenge powerful enemies. Examples include Spanish insurrections against Napoleon, the Chinese revolutions against the Japanese army, the North Vietnamese against the United States, and the South Vietnamese allies. And all of these violent dominated conflicts, military tools are subordinated to a larger political structure for the hearts and minds of the people. Now, they have not explained how violence can effectively fix Islamophobia, which means that they cannot resolve the case. We have explained how a pedagogy through nonviolence can unmake stereotypes and help. And now all of their arguments are historically false. We've indicted Gelder-Luce's study, and they haven't responded to it. He's attacking a straw person and assuming that nonviolence is passivity, which is obviously false and misleading historical information. That's our Martin evidence. Now, they have not impacted why we need to be super radical, which means that their second impact of nonviolence is irrelevant, and nonviolent resistance is super radical and capable of overcoming structural oppression. Bartowski 13. This volume discounts the sole important structural condition that is determined as the political change to give away to the role of conscientious and autonomous agency epitomized by independent action. Historical lens helps discover and show the path on the resilience of civil resistance despite constraining or oppressive conditions and structures that seemingly favored either armed rebellion or general passivity. Surrender structural conditions might explain how specific groups and actuals act, what options they pursue, and what possibilities they may realize. They not only influence trajectories of important social, economic, and political changes, but in essence made them happen. Now, violence is not neutral, can't be selectively.
You can skip that card.
Skip that card?
Yeah.
Okay. There was nothing racist or patriarchal about nonviolent action, Martin. 8. Arguments against nonviolent action Gelder-Luce arguments against nonviolent action misconstrues nonviolence, makes claims without evidence. Many pacifists do not engage in nonviolent action, and many nonviolent activists are not pacifists. Many nonviolent activists are feminists, and nonviolent activists are racist, paternalist, or too timid. But this does not mean that nonviolent action as a method of struggle has the same characteristics any more than the racism or other features of some violent activists, which means that violence is racist. It is also, it's not a form of passivity. That argument was about. Yeah, about.
How much time is that?
They have 7:20. I'll start that right now. I'm gonna get a little water.
Oh, we're gonna do that. I'm gonna go to the pessimism argument first. Then the domination critique, and then the case. I do not have 9 minutes.
You have 5 minutes.
There's an overview on top. I don't know if I said that. Okay, everybody ready? Professor Wilderson provides us with an important analogy about different kinds of resistance to oppression when he discusses the different kinds of resistance to oppression that we should imagine at a cattle ranch. The workers at the cattle ranch are subordinated, they're underpaid, and work in terrible conditions. But if anti-subordination struggles were able to give rights to the workers and alleviate their exploitation, it wouldn't do anything for the cows because the cows are not subordinated, they are accumulated and killed. So it is when comparing the affirmative and the negative impacts. Islamic people are subordinated, but black people are accumulated and killed. This is a huge difference in magnitude of scope of what the nature of the oppression is. A couple reasons that means the negative outweighs. Little a is that the scope of the antagonism is not comparable. There are 155 prisoners detained in Guantanamo. There are millions of black folks who are or have been in prison and disenfranchised, more than the number during the official time of slavery. Slavery is saturated across the globe. Islamophobia is the targeting of a comparatively smaller number of individuals during a temporary time period after 9/11. Little b is you should consider anti-blackness blackness as the foundational antagonism, where for instance, you can consider that Islamophobic people have been given habeas rights, that they're let go, that the war on terror does have a starting point and can't have an ending point, that Obama talks about winding down drugs. No such consideration is given to slavery, in which black people are accumulated and killed, in the same way that no such serious consideration is given to cows. Our argument is that you should consider the affirmative in Islamophobia to be collateral damage. For instance, when there are drone strikes, you might try to limit the collateral damage, i.e. we're trying to kill a terrorist, but we actually kill somebody else. You should consider the affirmative trying to stop that collateral damage. But our argument is that instead of trying to stop the collateral damage, we accidentally killed someone else. You should try to stop the strikes from occurring in the first place and try to stop the system which allowed that to occur, which proves why solving anti-blackness actually solves Islamophobia, because Islamophobia is an offshoot of anti-blackness because it's the traits that we identify of anti-blackness in Islamic people. Little c is that the alternative solves the case. Rashad very explicitly said this, and the 1-9 was not answered. In the 1AR, the alternative rejects everything. It rejects Islamophobia, it rejects Guantanamo, it rejects the state and law and civil society and the anti-blackness, which means we solve the case, and it's preferable to the permutation as well. He extends the permutation, but I've already explained why it's better to just have the alternative alone. There's a couple important link arguments that the permutation can't resolve. The first argument is that anti-blackness must be understood as the primary antagonism. That's all been explained above and in the 1R. If we try to consider other factors and other conflicts, it means that we don't pay attention to the ordering structure of the world. Additionally, Rashad makes an argument about affirmation, that we can't affirm anything until the world as we know it ends, which means the affirmative will be able to, affirming the affirmative, affirming the anti-subordination struggle is essentially affirming the world as we know it in anti-blackness. Additionally, we'll make link arguments on coalition and nonviolence. They say that we obstruct a coalition. Our argument is that even if they win this argument, a coalition for what? Our argument is that we sustain a coalition to resist anti-blackness, but maybe we disrupt a coalition which is not fundamentally antagonistic enough. It proves that they're holding us hostage, and it proves why the affirmative approach will always be watered down. They say if you use violence, if you go too far, if you talk about blackness too much, then we're not going to join your coalition, which proves why their coalition doesn't do anything except uphold civil society and the people who benefit from it, Islamophobia and anti-blackness. They say that anti-blackness is not explanatory, but then there's a lot of things that exist about the world that the affirmative has explaining to do. If anti-blackness is not explanatory, then why is it that in the war on drugs there are the same number of suburban white kids who are doing drugs as there are inner city kids who are doing drugs, and yet all of the police attention is focused on the inner city, even though we know for a fact that they're both doing drugs. We only pay attention to where the black people are. The number of black people in prisons is astounding, and if you can't can't explain that with anti-blackness, the affirmative needs to have some explanation for why such a disproportionately high number of black people are in prison. 80% of African Americans in certain parts of inner city Chicago have been disenfranchised and in prison. That doesn't make any sense otherwise. They say that crusades came first. Two arguments to answer. First, it's not the same magnitude. We left the crusades. The second is that even if it's true that anti-blackness came after, it means it ordered the world after the crusades, and so the preceding nature of the crusades is actually an argument against it. We'll answer the rest of the arguments on nonviolence. Domination critique. I'm not going for it. It can't be offense. There's no strategy to be able to affirm it. We've all proven why they can't break out of it. Plus, it proves our link on anti-blackness. Our Brittingham link proves they reify difference and don't attack the underlying power structures. We're the only piece of evidence about anti-subordination, which means don't let the 2AR get up and say that anti-subordination is a way to attack those power relations, because we've read evidence which indicates that it undermines it. It solidifies the black-white binary that was created by the whiteness in order to be able to dominate and enslave black people. It turns to the coalition arguments, and it proves it's only a reformist strategy, nonviolence. The only impact that they've indicated to nonviolence is patriarchy, which means that our foundational antagonism argument solves, because it means if we solve the primary antagonism of anti-blackness, that it solves other issues like Islamophobia and patriarchy as well. Plus, we've turned that argument with our evidence, which indicates that nonviolence is more patriarchal, because patriarchy is sustained by violence, which means they ensure that women will be unable to effectively fight back against the forces of patriarchy. Additionally, it proves, additionally, the nonviolence argument proves our anti-blackness link, because it proves that fundamentally about the productivity of the strategy. The 2AR will get up and say that our resistance can't work, but our argument is that affirmation and trying to work within the current system is a way to only uphold that system. We have to end the world as it exists. The nonviolence argument proves why the AF is fundamentally about reforming the existing order, which should effectively explain why we are locked in a war that can only end the destruction of the world or the destruction of blackness. How do you end the world nonviolently? Guantanamo is on an island. You can't just go up to the gates of Guantanamo, knock on it, and ask politely to let Islamic people in. The Domhoff card that they read is a huge mistake in the 1AR. If you read one card, please read the Domhoff card. It indicates that the reason why violence fails is because it was a political mistake. It increased the gulf between blacks and whites, and cities like New York and Detroit didn't recover from the withdrawal of investment, which proves it's fundamentally about having white people invest and keeping white people with money and not scaring them. They say violence can't solve Islamophobia. They've never read no evidence connecting the two. They say we've misconstrued nonviolence, but our Gelderlist evidence is quite good. They say Gelderlist doesn't use history, but we've used a bunch of historical arguments like the Holocaust, Vietnam. I've talked about Malcolm X and MLK to all be able to prove why we'll be able to dismiss nonviolent strategies.
438. I don't think so. Our explanation of racism better plus. Yeah, start with the
Ooh.
Sweet. So long as they're debating.
We have Tauson next round. Sounds like we'll get a little bit of a break.
45 minutes.
It's the case with an overview, then the domination K, and then pessimism. Is everyone ready?
Can I get the order one more time, sorry?
Case, domination, pessimism. You good?
Yeah.
If we win any of our non-violence arguments, then there's 3 implications for the debate. The first is that it proves that the alternative does not solve. You should filter all of their impact and weak arguments through the lens of solvency. They have to prove why negation is a productive method. It's largely a method debate since we both agree on the question of what impacts matter. Second is that it also proves that only the affirmative solves, which means that any other church case arguments do not make sense because if we prove that violence is a political strategy is ineffective, it proves they cannot resolve Islamophobia. Third, it means that we have an external disadvantage to the alternative, which means that even if they win all of their arguments for why the affirmative is bad or why we do not solve, we have an independent impact as to what movement. Our evidence cites the Spanish versus Napoleon, the Chinese versus the Japanese, the Vietnam versus the Vietnamese versus the United States, as well as a host of historical examples. Says that every instance in which we have glorified violent revolution has actually been the insurrectionists were the ones that solved in those instances. They have conceded that violence gets backlash against, and it allows the government to construct a narrative as the people as the ones that are challengers that are once violent, and lets them create a narrative that lets them get demobilized. Now they've also conceded the violence backfires on Protowski. Evans also gives the example of Ghana, Algeria, and Poland, which are instances in which non-violence was more productive. Now they see the impact of the foundational antagonism resolves patriarchy. First, even if this is true, it's a causality argument, not a solvency argument. Even if the foundational antagonism resulted in patriarchy, that's not a reason why you should use patriarchal methods and conceptions and description of success when resolving that foundational antagonism. Additionally, they have no explanation in the context of gender. Their arguments are about Islamophobia. Do not do the work that Jonah did not do in the Cunard Conductance. Now they see that we are more gender. The journalist evidence is indicted. Our Martin evidence specifically indicates that the association with non-violence is something that is patriarchal because it tends to keep women in place. Is something that we do not